instead of asking a question which just came in, I think we should just, I would like to thank you all for your presentations, but as you all know, the most interesting part is the question and answer session, and it's very nice that your presentations have provoked a few questions, probably also questions which relate to the region from where the people have joined. I will actually start with one which is on top, and I think that is to Dr. Krona, because you talked at the end, I think, of your presentation, you talked about counter-terrorist efforts of governments, which will also come up. So the question is related to that, and it says, in what way do you think that terrorists' use of modern combat technologies will shape the counter-terrorist tactics of governments, but primarily Western governments, and will their counter-terrorism measures, of the governments, will they shape itself, or will they be very much directed to the advancement of these groups?
I think it's a very important question, and I'm not a counter-terrorism expert, but my reflection is based on, I serve sometimes as expert witness in terrorism trials when it comes to how the law enforcement goes through the phones and computers of those who have been caught being, for instance, Islamic State supporters that have planned attacks in European countries, and the sort of the type of information that the government and the state can sort of obtain, depending on legislation. You can obtain it either after they're caught or by surveillance, which differs from different countries. I think it's just an important reflection to make, that this type of complete insights into personal data and everything, I think it's just a vital question to raise. What happens when the state and law enforcement have that type of possibilities? If that responsibility and that superiority can be used for more effective prevent measures, I think I'm all for it. But I can't remember the exact phrasing of the question, but how I think that counterterrorism may change. I think it's natural that counterterrorism and prevent work changes depending on the technological advancement. It's always been a sort of a cat and mouse game, that terrorist organizations are innovative and developing new strategies and use technologies in certain ways, and governments and law enforcement are trying to keep up with that development. But I do think that we are reaching a point where it's becoming more equal, and I think that the prevent strategies are being maybe developed more effectively. But that's just based on very personal experiences of that type of jobs. I wouldn't have a complete professional holistic view on it.
Thank you. I think, Postod, you are also a counterterrorism expert. Would you have a view on this question?
I think it is something that's been notable in a lot of the prosecutions that have occurred in the UK, that the authorities appear to have benefited from monitoring internet traffic, monitoring, via surveillance, individuals. And so, Michael's quite correct. It's a game of cat and mouse. It's also a game where the state can bring considerable resources into play, and does so successfully. I mentioned in my presentation some of those earlier. The Britons who went out to Afghanistan in the 1990s. I think obviously if some of those, for example, had smartphones, they would have been giving away far more about themselves than they actually did. And in the case of some of the Britons who went out to Syria, we ended up knowing quite a bit about what they'd been doing, who they'd been associating with, etc., etc.
So at some point of time, the advancement is also not to use these technological tools. So actually to not use the mobile phones and social media accounts.
Potentially, yes. Although equally, what could be more suspicious than an 18-year-old or a 21-year-old who doesn't have a mobile phone or doesn't use a mobile phone?
That's also true. Thank you. Then there's a question from the beginning to Dr. Mehran, and I'm going to read it out because it's quite a long question. Dr. Mehran, where would you place the international community as well as the social media itself in terms of responsibility of allowing the continuous propaganda and distribution of imagery of the Taliban, especially when we look at, for instance, the banning of Trump on Twitter versus Mujahid having an official Twitter account?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Well, in terms of technological companies and social media companies, they've been trying to, well, based on their own policies, they've taken down a whole bunch of Taliban's accounts. For example, Facebook currently does not allow for Taliban to use Facebook platform. So they're banned essentially. Zabihullah Mujahid, some of the well-known Taliban spokespersons, for example, Zabihullah Mujahid, and the rest do not have a Facebook account, as far as I know, until at least last week. So I don't know if it has changed since last week onwards. But as for Twitter, yes, the Taliban has had a presence on Twitter, Zabihullah Mujahid as the spokesperson, and some others, the Lia's office, for example, the other spokespersons of the Taliban, and Dr. Naeem, for example, had also a presence on Twitter, and many other Taliban followers have been allowed to use Twitter. So I think at the end of the day, it has been essentially the decision of these technology companies whether to allow or who to allow and who not to allow to use their platforms. Facebook appears to have a more strict policy in terms of circulation of violent material. And this has exactly raised the question that was just asked right now, that if people like Mujahid, Zabihullah Mujahid, are allowed to actually promote the Taliban on Facebook, why the president of a country, Trump, when Trump was in power, he was not allowed to use, he was banned by Twitter. And the decision, I think, and I'm not going to speak for Twitter, it has been Twitter's decision based on their policies, and I do not think, and I disagree with Twitter in allowing Taliban fighters to use the platform to promote their propaganda. So because the message they've sent, as I mentioned, it can contain violent and graphic material, it can propagate hate, and it has been encouraging violence. So it shouldn't have happened. As for how it will, what will happen in the future, and whether right now that the Taliban is in power, and whether this companies such as Facebook should allow the Taliban to use their platforms. I think at this point, the tech companies are just waiting to see if the Taliban will be recognized as a legitimate government of Afghanistan or not, and whether the type of material they're going to post on these platforms is in violation of their policies. So I think they are gauging that question right now. That would be my answer.
Can I just make one small comment to add to Dr. Mehran's intervention?
Of course, of course.
Yeah. I think one of the main issues is the reporting of accounts. What has happened is that the accounts of genuine human rights defenders, the accounts of serious Afghanistan scholars, like right now you can't even spell Taliban the way it's spelled in Dari and Persian language in Facebook. The moment you do it, your account is taken down. And so it has shrunk the space for people who need to be vocal, who share values with the Western world, who don't propagate violence, who are passing on important knowledge to others. But at the same time, they've allowed a lot of pro-Taliban accounts to operate. And I think that is one of the key issues, that these technological giants, if they don't want to engage with activists and with scholars in this part of the world directly, the governments in the West have to address this to make sure that the activists continue to voice their concerns and the grave situation of human rights under the Taliban in Afghanistan right now. At the same time, the mechanisms are not robust enough to make sure that the accounts of the Islamists, who are at times extremely dangerous with the kind of more information that they're relaying, that one can easily identify them and report them. So I think there is a need for engagement on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Malez, and I think it's a very important point to be made. These technological giants, of course, need to behave more responsibly in terms of when we talk about dissemination of propaganda or terrorist propaganda, in essence. We'll move on to one more question. Postdot, I think the people are not yet done with your answer on the nuclear weapons thing, because they have now, the question is a bit twisted now. Okay, well, we take your thing that maybe nuclear weapons are a bit too far, but because of the reported linkages, which Malez also talked about, the military establishment of Pakistan and Taliban. You talked about the Stinger missiles, which were given in, the 80s by the Americans. And how far do you see the military establishment providing the current Taliban, the government of Taliban, which is there now in Afghanistan? How far do you see the military establishment providing them with more technological weapons than the age-old AK-47 Kalashnikov, which they were using?
Well, I think it's been an underlying theme of our discussions today, and indeed the discussions over the past month, that yes, the Taliban have won a military victory in Afghanistan, but also to at least some extent, perhaps a larger extent, that's a victory for Pakistan, and that Pakistan's been absolutely central to those events. The Taliban being in control of Afghanistan gives Pakistan strategic depth. So it's happy with that border. It can concentrate, if you like, on what it sees as the permanent challenge from India. So does Pakistan want to continue arming the Taliban, supporting them, engaging them, assisting them diplomatically, assisting them in terms of intelligence? I think almost certainly yes. And that then raises big questions for the rest of the world. How is the rest of the world going to relate to a Pakistan that's behaving in that way? How is, ostensible allies like the UK, like the United States, potentially, China's role will come under much greater scrutiny. And I think all of that needs to happen. It's probably a shame it didn't happen earlier.
And how do you think the world is going to react now?
Well, how it should and how it will isn't necessarily the same thing. My concern would be that we're very focused on Afghanistan at the moment. 6 months and a year down the line, that interest greatly wanes. Yeah. And so I think there's a role for organisations like EFSAS, a role for individuals like those who are presenting today to ensure that doesn't happen.
Thank you, Postdot. There's one more question to Malez, and I'll come back to Malez, but I'll just have one question which has been typed twice, and I think There's no name. I think it's to Dr. Krona, but maybe anyone can answer, but probably it relates to Dr. Krona. But if someone else has something to say, can say it as well. When it comes to the region of Jammu and Kashmir, you talked about groups referring to that region. That's one. The second is when it comes to the region of Jammu and Kashmir, what type of social media channels do terrorist groups tend to resort to? And I think the question is also the terrorist groups which are, not the Al-Qaeda or the ISIS outside, but also the terrorist group which are maybe based there or there in the region. What kind of social media channels are mostly used?
I think it's you can't really know 100% unless you're in the region and talking to these individuals. But based on the trends that you see in, for instance, the supporter groups of the Islamic State, including from Kashmir region and Jammu, at least they claim to be from there, are using primarily Telegram. That's the main platform that they are promoting their material on, they're publishing their PDFs on. But you also, if you do a simple search on Twitter, you see a lot of accounts. Most probably the majority of them are automated accounts and not necessarily individuals behind them, that has a geolocation from Kashmir or Jammu. So open social media and more encrypted social media, I would say. And I think Telegram is still the main platform, at least for jihadist terrorist organizations. That would be my general answer to it.
Okay, thank you. Before I come back to Malaz, one more question, which is related to the answer Dr. Stott just provided about the technological advancement. Dr. Stott, the question is, what do you think about, for example, there was, I referred to it in my introduction as well, there was this recent attack in Jammu, what Dr. Krona was also talking about, with a drone. And you also talked about drones flying in the UK over the airport, which was then closed. So in a place like South Asia, and then we can take this example of Jammu, for example, of course, these drone attacks are perhaps maybe more difficult to do, but they take out a lot of risks of someone going across the border, taking the weapons. It's maybe, robotic almost. Do you see this trend going forward?
Yes, there's been a lot of research done by there's a guy, Andrew Staniforth in the UK, has done a lot of research on drones, and I touched a little bit on Islamic State's use of drones in Iraq and Syria. You've mentioned cases in Kashmir, obviously, others in Afghanistan. We haven't yet seen a terrorist attack utilizing a drone in Europe, but it is clearly only a matter of time, unfortunately, until we do. And the advantage, obviously, is to the individual that, they can be anything up to a mile away from the scene of that attack. So it leaves an individual free to either carry out further attacks themselves at that time or at a later date. So the utility for terrorist groups is very strong.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to the last 3, 4. Oh, I just got another one. 3, 4, 5. I'm just gonna, while I ask this question, I'm gonna try to club them together. I know it's late, so I'll try to club them. There's one question to Malaz. Malaz, you of course talked about and quite openly talked about the linkages between the ISI and the Taliban. How do you see the visit of the ISI chief recently in Kabul and the forming of the government of Taliban? And I see Dr. Mehran nodding, so she can reply on this as well. So the forming of the government in Afghanistan, but also some kind of rumors, and I'm not sure whether that's correct or not, of Mullah Baradar being punched, getting into a fight with the Haqqanis. What happened?
I think the visit of Faiz Hamid was only attributed to the formation of the caretaker government. It's first of all a caretaker government, and it was said that it was because of him that the Haqqani network, the preferred element within Taliban, was because of his presence. I mean, I think what is really odd that he stayed there for 3 days, and that's a long time for a foreign intelligence chief to stay in a country that still doesn't have a functioning government. But I believe, and I have confirmed it also from some channels, both in Kabul and also in the resistance in Panjshir, that he mainly directed the Panjshir. It's not, I mean, Panjshir has not been conquered thoroughly. I should mention that. But anyhow, he wanted to make sure that Panjshir is taken. The governor's office is taken. Taliban flag is hoisted there. So I think it had multiple purposes, but the main purpose was the Panjshir resistance, because they didn't want to have the kind of situation that they had in the 1990s that would potentially be exploited by both regional and global powers to challenge the Taliban and their domination of the country. So that's one aspect of it. The second aspect is obviously the formation of the government. I think this clash in Argan, the presidential palace, has taken place. Taliban have spoken about it, obviously anonymously, to different media organizations. They've thrown stuff to each other, and their bodyguards have shot at each other. Mullah Brother is still in Kandahar. The video footage, first of all, the audio footage that was released by Taliban raised a lot of questions, and then the video footage, when it was released, he was reading from paper. Even the journalist who was asking the questions, the 2 questions he posed, he was also reading from the paper. So it looked very suspicious. But we know for sure, we've obtained the leaked message of the Helmandi Taliban, who actually was the cornerstone of Taliban resistance, who basically said that the guest, as in the ISI chief, he messed up the whole thing, the new government, and they left Kabul and went back to Helmand. And the last point is, because of the non-appearance of the supreme leader of Taliban, Mullah Hibatullah, everybody is like, who's going to now solve these conflicts, internal conflicts? And suspicion is again that the supreme leader has died. That's why you have all these conflicts. So to sum it up, fighting a war in such a decentralized, networked way was one thing, but governance and running an entire country of almost 40 million people is a totally different challenge. And I think Taliban are not up to it. And I don't think Taliban will survive a very long time. This may be a controversial comment. I rarely divulge this kind of information, especially this kind of prospective analysis, but it seems very unlikely that they will be able to dominate the entire country for a long time. So it would be either be a civil war, or if they show some wisdom, they have to bring other people under the tent. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Mehran, you want to say something, or?
No, actually, Malays gave a very comprehensive answer to that. As far as I can second all of his point and emphasize on one, that the fragmentation, the mere fact that the chief of ISI showed up in Kabul also points to the fragmentation of the group, which makes the Taliban and the government that is trying to establish a lot more fragile, as it shows how fragile it is.
One thing I forgot, the Panjshiri resistance, the channels I have with them, they said the reason why he also appeared was that the special services groups, the very groups that existed in Afghanistan, ISI units that existed in Afghanistan in the 1990s, they could not be directly commanded by Taliban. So there had to be someone from Pakistan to come in and command them, and also the aerial support that they're accusing Pakistan provided. So General Hamid had to be there to do that himself. Thank you.
Can I add one other point which follows back from what Malay said, and I'm slightly also saying it jokingly, that the reason they're not showing their faces to the camera for some of these Taliban leadership is because their bounties are their heads for millions of dollars. So that could be, I mean, I'm saying it jokingly, but at the same time, that could be the reason that, I mean, at least 17 of them are on some form of the caretaker cabinet or some form of a terrorist designated list. So if everybody knows how they look like and they propagate their messages, I mean, there would be more enemies, more people who are searching for those bounties. And unless the Taliban wants to keep them to cash them out later on when they need the money. So
that's a really strange thing that, you know, more than half of the cabinet is listed on some kind of sanctions list. I have one question for Dr. Krona, but before I go back to that, just one question, Dr. Miran, because I have you now already. Do you think that the Taliban are going to restrict internet access in Afghanistan soon or in the future?
I hope not, but there is a very much risk of it, because the Taliban so far has tried that, tapped their toes in the water, trying to restrict access in different parts of the country, particularly after the general protests in Kabul. They restricted internet access in some parts of Kabul because they were worried that the message will get out. So I think the Taliban at this point, because they are waiting for the diplomatic recognition by the international community, they are cautious not to do this because it would definitely undermine their chances of getting that. But there are very much possibilities that once the group establishes itself, if it does and has a grip, a very firm grip over power, they might be definitely doing that. They've already been trying it in different patches, different parts of the country.
Can I also add another point here? And they've obviously they restricted internet to parts of Kabul. They restricted internet to Panjshir, but they've also used particularly WhatsApp to track down activists. So they are using the same blueprint from countries like Egypt, where they use social media extensively to track down these networks, individuals, and then to persecute them. So I think they will do both. Where they see fit, they will restrict internet, but at the same time allow people to share information and then go after them.
No, we saw it already in Panjshir. Of course, they restricted it there. Then I have two questions. I think these are to both Dr. Krona and Dr. Stott. So I'll read them up both, and then I think you can take them as you like it. One is, will the capacity to control more sophisticated technology enhance terrorist organizations to then also control more territory like ISIS did? And the second question, which is different, but there's no name to whom it's asked, is how can the protection of privacy and civil rights be ensured, given that governments may feel inclined to increasingly monitor the online activities of their citizens? Two questions. I think one of them is they're directed to one of you or both of you. So please, whoever wants to.
I can go.
I can just give a very brief answer in terms of technology and groups like Islamic State. I mean, obviously, part of what IS was looking to do was to develop a caliphate that was in potentially different parts of the world, a territory which could take in parts of the Middle East, parts of Africa, etc., etc. And in a way, technology, social media, the internet, that's the only way to unite, to bring together those sorts of very disparate territories if they're not going to directly border one another. So I think the modern technology assists that idea that's in people's minds, and it anything which makes the world smaller helps those of universalist ideals, which is what you have from groups like Islamic State. But Michael may have other views, I don't know.
No, I disagree. Sorry, I fully agree with that notion. I don't think there's necessarily a direct correlation from having a very intense or intense media operation that would lead necessarily to advancing territorially. But as you said, the mechanisms behind it, the mechanisms of collecting or sort of getting groups together and using technologies like that, that is an underlying factor for the long run to have more territorial advances. It also depends on how skillful an organization is to use. We saw in Iraq in 2014 how certain campaigns on social media was used to take new grounds, to take new cities, new territories. But as I said, I completely agree that it is a contributing factor, but not necessarily the main one. And the second question that was posed regarding protection of privacy, just a short note on it, that's $1 million question. What is the balance between governments and authorities need sometimes in prevent work to surveil citizens? But how does the privacy and civil rights are being ensured? I don't think there is a simple solution to that. It's a constant discussion of how do we balance that in a democratic and secure way. But there is no real answer to it, in my opinion.
Thank you. No, it's indeed that is the most difficult balance which governments have to find. There's one other question. I think I can answer that. Would SIX be able to get back while Afghanistan is ruled by the Taliban? I think no, that's not going to happen. I think many Afghans who are not supporting the Taliban cannot go back. So let alone people who have a different religion. So that's not going to happen. I think there's one more question, which is basically, it's from someone who has identified themselves as saying they're from India. So I understand the question. Will Taliban with Pakistani help do some sort of terrorist activity in Kashmir? I want to actually broaden that question and then end with that, because it's almost 6 o'clock. But the question I would have then is, you of course saw after the Soviet withdrawal in 1989, many of these battled, hardened jihadis needed a place to go to fight, and some of them ended up in the region of Jammu and Kashmir. While I do believe that the Taliban itself might not see any merit in going to Kashmir, now that they control a territory and are faced with a lot of challenges of running that country, like Malaz has said, which they probably will not be able to. But indeed, the question I would have on top of this one is, would you see this terrorism jihadi narrative now suddenly shifting because of this triumph of Taliban, which they have achieved in Afghanistan? And do you see either the Taliban, maybe I'm wrong, or other jihadi groups like the Lashkar, like the Jaish, who have worked together with the Taliban and helped them, that maybe now it's payback time for them, and the Taliban will help them and they will move towards Kashmir again, and we might see another very difficult period in that region. So that's for all panels, and I think everyone could and can speak on that. So
can I just say quickly, I think one of the main issues is, and there was a recent newspaper report, I don't remember which newspaper, that Taliban fighters are bored in Kabul and they miss fighting, and at the same time their life has lost a purpose. They wanted to become a martyr and go to the heaven, and that hasn't happened. So they will look for ways to continue on that journey. That's one thing. So this time, seriously, I can see Afghan Taliban fighting in places like Kashmir. Secondly, even the model Taliban, the so-called diplomats who are based in Qatar, Sohail Shaheen, one of them, they've already expressed sympathy for the so-called struggle of Kashmiri Muslims against the Indian state. And then you have the red units of Taliban, and we know that they have a symbiotic relationship with Lashkar-e-Taiba. So I can see that these red units, again, battle hardened, they have no other purpose in life but to fight on, to have international Islamic State, or to die doing so. So I can see them appear in Kashmir. Obviously, this would necessitate the cooperation and coordination by the Pakistani ISI. I don't know how far they would go with this, because to them, Afghanistan is already a big prize. And if any of the Taliban are found in Kashmir, that might be one of the red lines for the international community to take action.
Anyone else? I think Paul Stott, this
yes,
is
just to say, when we saw recently the death of the elderly Kashmiri leader in India, the pro-Pakistani figure, Gilani, and it was interesting to see on social media General Zia's son tweeting not just an appreciation of Saeed Gilani, but also connecting the Kashmir struggle to that in Afghanistan, and basically saying that the struggle continues. It's taken 43 years or whatever to be successful in Afghanistan. It will continue in Kashmir until the Pakistani flag flies in Srinagar, what have you. And there's a contrast, I think, to make here, that Joe Biden and others are opposed to forever wars. For some people, there are forever jihads. And what those guys have at the moment is a degree of momentum and excitement because of events in Afghanistan. And that will have an influence on other struggles.
Just to quickly second that the victory of Taliban in Afghanistan has sent a message to the rest of the global jihadi movements, that extremist movements, that it is simply possible, that victory is reachable and it can be achieved. So that is something that a lot of groups have been capitalizing on in order to strengthen their position and send a message out that join us, it is possible to achieve victory. So.
And just let me second what has been said already. I think in general, we have seen how narratives within the global jihadist movement are being adapted to what's happening on the ground, the geopolitical developments, the different type of conflicts. And I think the momentum that they are in, that was just mentioned, will continue, not least for someone like myself who sees the supporter and the narratives that goes on online. I think we have very, very complicated months and years ahead in this regard.
So we shouldn't let our guard down, of course, also not in Europe, because I think apart from the fact that the Taliban and their victory, or the so-called victory, can influence terrorist groups in the region, jihadists and even just lone wolf terrorists here could also be, of course, emboldened by the Taliban defeating yet another superpower in the span of what is it, 20, 30 years. We could go on, but I think it has been long enough. I want to thank you all, Dr. Paul Stott, Malez Daoud, Dr. Vida Mehran, and Dr. Michael Corona. And thank you very much for your very interesting presentations. Also, thank you for engaging in this very vibrant Q&A session. Your videos, of course, will be uploaded on YouTube and on the website, and I will also send you a mail with the links. And I will just end on this note that hopefully we can get rid of this current situation with COVID, of course, and if not the UNHRC in March, as soon as possible, the moment things get open, we should plan and would plan to meet somewhere and do something in person, because I think everyone is starting to miss that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Denise.